there would potentially be an opportunity for the Department of Transportation to spend more money on emergency response and security than the $10 million that's allotted for them, or the little over $10 million that's allotted to them for the whole year. And, Mr. Chairman, I'd yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Iowa rise?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to say I'm not opposed to the amendment. I am going to call for a recorded vote. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I support the gentleman's amendment. It ensures that the Office of Intelligence, Security, and Emergency Response would receive no less than $10,786. This office performs the important security functions of the Department of Transportation, and I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The gentleman from Iowa rise.
I would ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant, and that way the ayes have it. Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment, the gentleman from Texas will be postponed. For what purpose the gentleman from Alaska rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the desk.
The clerk will read.
What?
Okay,
We're not there yet?
It is, we're not, the gentleman is not there. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today to express my strong opposition to the draconian cuts to the Community Development Block Grant CDBG program in this legislation. The CDBG program has a proven record of success in stabilizing and revitalizing communities across the country by directly providing funds to local communities and giving them flexibility to decide where the funding will have the greatest impact. In the last 7 years, CDBG has assisted over 1 million low and moderate income homeowners to rehabilitate their homes, keeping neighborhoods and communities safe and stable. More than 30 million people have benefited from CDBG-funded public improvement programs, including senior and child care centers, homes for persons with disabilities, safe streets, and shelters for victims of domestic violence. Funds have also been used to provide public services to millions of low and moderate income households, including employment training, meals for seniors, and services for abused children. But the real impact of CDBG is not seen on the national scale. It is seen on the streets and in the neighborhoods of the communities that receive these funds. In my district, CDBG funds have established adult literacy programs, legal support for immigrant victims of domestic violence, and youth summer employment opportunities. It has preserved public housing and addressed vacant housing in lots in at-risk neighborhoods, provided support and guidance for small, locally owned businesses. Because of the flexibility CDBG provides, the city government has been able to identify the most pressing needs and the most at-risk communities and allocate funds as they are needed. When we invest CDBG funds in our city, we see an immediate impact in the neighborhoods as nonprofit and private entities follow, bringing new development and opportunities for residents. Mr. Chairman, CDBG was a change from the old way in which specific programs were specifically funded. And people in this House, mostly Republicans, I must say, said, give more flexibility to local governments. Instead of giving 20 categorical specific programs, fund them into 1 or 2 block grants, community development block grants, so they can be used more efficiently. And we have done that. We have combined a lot of categorical programs into CDBG, and now we want to tear it to pieces. Despite the success that CDBG has had, the bill we are debating on the floor today would cut funding to $1.6 billion, a 50% cut from this year, and the lowest funding level in the 40-year history of the program, lower than when President Ford supported it, even without inflation adjustments. In New York, CDBG funding would fall from $164 million to $82 million. These funding levels will leave hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers and millions of Americans without access to the vital services and support that CDBG provides. And how did we get here? Why are we voting to gut this proven, efficient, flexible program Why are we voting for a 50% cut in an already much too small allotment? The answer is simple. The slash and burn Republican budget. The same budget that provides tax breaks for the wealthy and large corporations and unneeded increases in defense spending while slashing funding for Medicaid, food stamps, and women and children's funding has left appropriators with such small funding allocations that this bill was unworkable and unrealistic from the start. So here we are, slashing programs that serve and protect the most vulnerable among us, programs that are proven to save us money in the long run, and programs that support flexibility and accountability in our communities. We may disagree, Mr. Speaker, on how to keep our economy strong, but we should all agree that we must stop piling these cuts in the backs of seniors, the working poor, women, kids, and the middle class. Stop these cuts to our communities. We should reject this bill unless it's grossly increased in the aggregate, which it won't be, as we know. So we should reject this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Yields back. For what purposes, gentleman from New York, rise.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with my colleague from New York. This bill has too many cuts, and I will oppose final passage. But it does have comparable funding levels between the House and Senate for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which administers distracted driving prevention grants to the states. This is an area where we need to do more. Every year, thousands of accidents, many fatal, result from people texting or talking on their phones while driving. Now, I'm not just talking about using a hands-free device. I'm talking about someone driving with one hand while talking on a cell phone or texting with the other hand. In 2011, 3,331 people in the U.S. were killed in crashes involving a distracted driver, up from 3,267 in 2010. And in 2011, more than 387,000 people were injured in an accident involving a distracted driver, and 416,000 were injured in 2010. In 2011, the last year of updated data, 10% of injury crashes resulted from distracted driving, and it's clear that we must use every opportunity available to push for strong distracted driving laws, much the same as we did for drunk driving, which worked. So I encourage my colleagues to renew their commitment to address the deadly issue of distracted driving. My Distracted Driving Prevention Act, H.R. 1664, withholds funding from states that do not make both texting and talking on a phone while driving a primary offense, and goes further than the U.S. Department of Transportation's efforts to raise awareness and provide grants. These are important efforts, and they should be funded adequately, but they don't go far enough. To date, only 9 states make both texting and talking on a phone while driving a primary offense. My home state of New York does, followed by California, Connecticut, Delaware, Washington, D.C., Nevada, New Jersey, Washington, and West Virginia. That's a start, but it falls short of establishing a national highway safety baseline that saves lives. In conclusion, let me say, when study after study shows us that distracted driving is just as dangerous as drunk driving, Congress cannot continue to ignore the problem when only 9 states have taken action that meets a reasonable standard of safety. Anything less leaves our roads unsafe, our constituents in danger, and more unnecessary deaths as a result. I urge adoption of my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Clerk will read.
Page 4, line 3, Research and Technology, $14,220,000.
Gentleman from Carter suspend. What purpose, gentleman from Iowa, rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, number 19.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Latham of Iowa.
Dispense with the reading.
Is there objection? Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Latham of Iowa.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this is a technical amendment that provides existing $14.7 million in DOT funding to the Research and Innovative Technology Administration rather than a new Assistant Secretary. This amendment is non-controversial and addresses concerns of the Science and Transportation and Infrastructure Committees. It does not affect the scoring of the bill, and I urge its adoption. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose, the gentleman from Arizona, rise.
Mr. Chairman, we have no objection to the amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Question is all on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Iowa. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Clerk will read.
Page 5, line 7, national infrastructure investments of the funds made available under Division F of Public Law 113-6, $237 million are rescinded. Financial Management Capital, $4,990,000 to remain available through September 30th, 2015. Cybersecurity Initiatives, $2 million to remain available through September 30th, 2015. Office of Civil Rights, $9,384,000. Transportation Planning, Research and Development, $6 million to remain available through September 30th, 2015. Working Capital Fund, $172 million. Minority Business Resource Center Program, $333,000. In addition, for administrative expenses, $589,000.
Clerk will suspend. For what purpose the gentleman from Alaska rise?
I have an amendment to the desk.
The clerk will continue to read.
Minority Business Outreach, $3,068,000 to remain available until September 30th, 2015. Payments to air carriers, Airport and Airway Trust Fund, $100 million.
For what purpose the gentleman from
I have an
Alaska
amendment to
rise?
the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
And thanks for watching me bob up and down. It's sort of exciting to watch that.
Amendment offered by Mr. Young of Alaska, page 9, line 6. After communities, insert in the 48 contiguous states.
The gentleman from Alaska is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Chairman Latham for his leadership on this bill. It's difficult times. This is a very simple amendment. In 1978, the Congress deregulated the airline industry, so also provided a means to protect rural communities. The Essential Air Service Program ensures a continuous of service to communities that would have lost all air service through deregulation. While this is a vital program, I respect the efforts of the chairman to find cost savings. The bill excludes communities from participating in the program if they receive per passenger subsidy of greater than $500. Current law excludes communities if they receive over $1,000 per passenger, with the exception of the communities of Alaska and Hawaii. This recognizes that communities in Alaska and Hawaii are completely dependent on air travel. Alaska has limited road infrastructure. 82% of Alaskan communities do not have a road system. In many communities, the only thing is by air. My amendment clarifies that the proposed reforms will not alter the long-standing recognition of the realities of Alaska and Hawaii. No roads, no alternatives, complete dependence on aviation. My amendment has no score with CBO and does not impact funding the levels of the program. My amendment provides no cost solutions to ensure the most remote areas of our nation are not excluded from participating in this program. I'd just like to remind my colleagues, if you take all the land east of the Mississippi River to the Atlantic Ocean, from Maine to Florida, that's Alaska. And you think about it, in that area there's 253 congressmen and 52 senators. That's really different. Hawaii has the same problem, not quite as large, but we have only one way to communicate, and that's with air service. I urge the passage of this amendment. It's a very simple amendment, and I thank the chairman.
The gentleman yields back. For purpose, the gentleman from Iowa rise.
Strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I just will stand up in favor of the amendment, and I will be calling a recorded vote. And I yield back.
Yields back. For what purpose, the gentlelady from Hawaii rise.
Mr. Speaker, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong support of the Young Amendment. This amendment will continue the administration of the Essential Air Service Program, recognizing the unique characteristics of both Hawaii and Alaska. The Essential Air Service Program was put into place to guarantee that small communities, like the communities in our states, will continue to maintain a minimal level of scheduled air service with access to the national air transportation system. Especially in times of medical emergencies or natural disasters, this literally is the difference between life and death for the people in our communities. In a state like Hawaii, where I'm from, where island communities are separated by the Pacific Ocean, access to air service is oftentimes the only transportation option available if service needs to be provided with any regularity or within specific time constraints. One example is Kalopapa, a community on an isolated peninsula on the north shore of Molokai. When Hansen's disease was first introduced to the Hawaiian Islands, all people afflicted with this disease were sent to this rural community, Kalopapa. Today it is a refuge for the remaining residents and patients who, now cured, would still live there. If not for the assistance of the Essential Air Service Program, the only way to get in and out of that community is a 3.5-mile trail down a 1,700-foot sea cliff used by mule riders and hikers. This trail is extremely steep and challenging and has been made impassable in the past because of heavy rains. This is just one example of why this continued air service is critical to the people who continue to live in this community. Hawaii and Alaska, as illustrated, have very unique geographical limitations and challenges. Whereas other communities are generally accessible by vehicle, that's not always the case in the non-contiguous states. 3.5 miles doesn't sound very far until you're looking up the side of a steep cliff from the back of a mule. The amendment being offered by Representative Young would continue this program's recognition of our exceptional geographic challenges. This amendment maintains the current practice of Alaska and Hawaii being exempt from restrictions on what communities are eligible for the Essential Air Service program. Currently, only 2 communities in Hawaii qualify, Kalaupapa and Kamuela. But maintaining this air service is critically important for all people who live in these areas. I'd also just like to take a moment to recognize my colleague from Hawaii, Congresswoman Colleen Hanabusa. She's worked very closely with Congressman Young on this amendment and would have liked to have been here to speak in strong support of it today, if not for Tropical Storm Flossie, where she is stuck in Hawaii, across the Pacific Ocean away. I'd like to thank Representative Young for offering this amendment, for his leadership, and strongly urge my colleagues to support the Young amendment and yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. Any other seeking recognition? The question is on the gentleman from Florida.
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this amendment, and I want to make sure my friends who live far, far away from where I live do understand that many of us understand the dynamics that they've presented. Arguably, their argument is unassailable, and I rise in support of their amendment.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alaska. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair is the ayes have it. The amendment for what purpose the gentleman from Iowa rise?
Ask for recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alaska will be postponed. Clerk, for what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment. Will the gentleman specify the amendment?
This is Grayson number 190.
Clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Mr. Grayson of Florida, page 9, line 7, after the dollar amount insert reduced by $250.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, the Essential Air Program is an expensive government handout. It is, in effect, welfare for airplanes. Page 9 of the bill expressly states that the per-passenger subsidy extended to rural communities, and by the way, we're not talking about Hawaii and Alaska here, we're talking about places like Muscle Shoals, for a flight that would not otherwise exist, is capped at $500. I think that's too high. I don't know why we should be, in effect, paying people $500 to fly to Muscle Shoals. I don't see the sense of that at a time when we're cutting food stamps and cutting block grants to communities. I think it's a poor way to spend taxpayer funds. My amendment would reduce this subsidy to a still very high $250 per passenger, because $500 per passenger is simply outrageous. If passengers don't want to pay for aviation routes, then they simply shouldn't exist. For $500 per passenger, we could literally rent a limousine for every single person aboard each flight and drive them to the single nearest commercial airport. I understand the need for rural services and necessary aspects of life like postal services, telephones, and even the Internet. But I cannot understand the need to subsidize regular airline flights that would otherwise not exist to the tune of $500 per passenger. The bill before us today would cut community development funds in half, to the lowest level since the program began in 1975. It would cut home investment partnerships to the lowest level since that program began in 1992. And it would drastically reduce the amount of Section 8 rental assistance and increase homelessness. Under these circumstances, I cannot stand by in good conscience and allow a subsidy like this to continue. I offer this amendment today because it's more important to put a roof over the heads of the poor than it is to hand out corporate welfare to United Airlines and to support aviation routes that simply should not exist. I yield the balance of my time. Sorry, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman cannot reserve. The gentleman yields. What purpose does the gentleman from Iowa rise?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to this amendment. We have in the bill restrained the growth of this program, keeping the total amount of $216 million, $116 million of which is from fees and $100 million provided in discretionary appropriation for the fiscal year 2012 program level. So it's at the same level as it was before. We don't have any increase. Mr. Chairman, I really urge the administration, the authorizers, if they want to reform this program, to actually get to work, do it not on an appropriation bill where we have had no discussion, no debate. It is an issue that should be handled by the authorizers rather than on this appropriation bill. We need the comprehensive reform so that isolated communities can be served and while restraining growth in this program. But I do urge a no vote, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I would agree with Chairman Latham that this reform needs to come about, and it shouldn't be in an appropriation bill, and hopefully the TNI authorizing committee will look at this issue and come to a decision. It was interesting that the amendment before this amendment, we basically waived Hawaii and Alaska, and here we are now limiting the essential air service $250. And I would tell you, as we try to explain to my colleague from Florida, that this would probably cause 100, maybe a little more, smaller communities not to be able to link to the national air service. So this is not the time to do it, and so I would rise in opposition to this amendment, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Amendment is not agreed to. What?
I would ask for a recorded vote.
Gentleman from Iowa requested a recorded vote pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18. Further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida will be postponed. For purpose, the gentleman from California rise.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. McClintock of California.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment simply continues the good work started by the amendment of the gentleman from Florida and pulls the plug on this tired old program. Recently, the much maligned sequester required a 4% cut in the FAA budget, which its leadership then immediately translated into a 40% flight delay until the public rebelled. The total sequester cut to the FAA was roughly $636 million, and they took that out on the traveling public. And yet, they had $243 million to pay for empty and near-empty flights from selected airports in tiny communities under this program that's laughingly called Essential Air Service. It is, in fact, the least essential air service imaginable. Now, since we last visited this issue, the FAA reauthorization bill made some minor reforms to the program. For example, we're no longer subsidizing air travel from communities that are within a 90-mile radius of a major airport, and the per-passenger subsidy has been capped at $1,000 per passenger. These minor reforms mean that one airport in Ely, Nevada, has been dropped from the program, and 2 more are about to be. That's a start. But still, it is no excuse for shoveling, as this appropriation does, a total of $216 million at this program between direct taxpayer subsidies and fees into the next year. In other words, in this austere age of sequestration, when the White House is shuttered to the public and soldiers are being told to pay for their own Internet access, The House of Representatives proposes at best a token reduction in this wasteful, unfair, and outdated program while cutting real essential air services like air traffic control. With all due respect, what in the world are we thinking? Remember, this was supposed to be a temporary program when we deregulated commercial aviation. It was supposed to last for just a few years to give rural communities a chance to adjust. That was 35 years ago. It's true there are a few tiny communities in Alaska, like Cake's 700 hardy souls, who have no highway connections to hub airports, but they have plenty of alternatives. In the case of Cake, they enjoy year-round ferry service to Juneau. In addition, Alaska is well served by a thriving general aviation market and the ubiquitous bush pilot. Rural life has great advantages and great disadvantages, and it's not the job of hard-working taxpayers who choose to live elsewhere to level out these differences. Now, apologists for this wasteful spending tell us it's an important economic driver for these small towns, and I'm sure that's so. Whenever you give away money, the folks you're giving it to are always going to be better off. But the folks you're taking it from are always going to be worse off to exactly the same extent. Indeed, it's economic drivers like this that have driven Europe's economy right off a cliff. Now, last year, one member rushed to the microphones to suggest that this was essential for emergency medical evacuations. We heard an echo of that a moment ago. It has nothing to do with medical evacuations. This program subsidizes regular, scheduled commercial service that practically nobody uses. If it actually had a passenger base, we wouldn't need, in effect, to hand $1,000 bills to the few passengers who use it, would we? An airline so reckless with its funds would quickly bankrupt itself. The same principle holds true of governments. Now, the Washington Post is not known as a bastion of fiscal conservatism, but I cannot improve upon the Post's recent editorial when it said, quote, ideally, essential air service would be zeroed out, and the $200 million we waste on it would be devoted to a truly national purpose, perhaps deficit reduction, military readiness, or the social safety net. Alas, if Congress and the White House were capable of making such choices, we probably never would have had sequestration in the first place, end of quote. There are many tough calls in setting fiscal priorities, but this isn't one of them. If the House of Representatives, where all appropriations begin, with a Republican majority pledged to stop wasting money, cannot even agree to cut this useless program off in the trough, how does it expect to be taken seriously on the much tougher choices that lie ahead? I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Iowa rise?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I rise to oppose the gentleman's amendment. The Essential Air Service Program ensures that small and rural communities have access to the National Air Transportation System. The program plays a key role in the economic development of many rural communities by ensuring that air service continues. Does the program need reform? Absolutely, it does, yes. And that's why we capped the per-passenger subsidy at $500, which is down from the current $1,000 cap per passenger. We have also cut the discretionary funding in this bill by $46 million, leaving a total program level of $216. Only $100 of that is from discretionary funding, but $116 million is from fees. This is an 18% reduction, and we already have imposed a significant cut to this program. We will continue to push the administration to reform the program and work with the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, but an outright elimination of the funding in this bill is a hit to rural communities that I cannot support. I urge defeat of the amendment, and I yield back the balance.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise? The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
To speak in opposition to the amendment. The Essential Air Service Program was designed to continue air service for small communities that had scheduled air service prior to airline deregulation. It is funded through annual appropriations and overflight fees that are collected when foreign air carriers transverse through U.S. airspace. This amendment cuts the overall program in half. Many small communities would lose their air service, including, we believe, 4 communities in the state of California. Crescent City, El Centro, Merced, and Visalia. This is not the way to reform this program, and so I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For purpose, the gentleman from North Carolina rise.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank the Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as a co-sponsor of this amendment, I rise to speak in support of eliminating the Essential Air Service Program. I thank my colleague from California, Mr. McClintock, for his work on this amendment. But another Californian once said there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. Mr. Chairman, I'm sure all my colleagues recognize that famous line from former President Ronald Reagan. His statement was accurate then, just as is accurate now regarding the Essential Air Service Program. This program was intended to be temporary. It was created as a transition program in the 70s after airline deregulation to help rural airports adjust to a free market system. We're now more than 25 years after the intended end date of 1988, and the taxpayers are still footing the bill. This is yet another example of Washington's spending problem, Mr. Chairman. It has to stop. And so I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For purpose, the gentleman from Nebraska rise.
Mr. Speaker, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment. I certainly understand all federal programs should be prepared and subjected to cost-saving measures, and Essential Air Service is actually no different. But that's why we passed reforms during the FAA reauthorization last year to improve efficiency and save taxpayer dollars. Additionally, the underlying bill today already includes a reduction in funding for the EAS program. While there is room for savings in all programs, totally eliminating EAS outright would be counterproductive. The Essential Air Service program serves an important purpose in rural and remote areas. Businesses in rural America actually compete more effectively with even the limited air service that might be available. Last year, the House rejected this amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to do so once again. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Gentleman from California.
It's for recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. Clerk, read.
Page 9, line 8. Administrative Provisions, Office of the Secretary of Transportation. Section 101. None of the funds may be obligated to approve assessments pertaining to funds appropriated to the model administrations. Section 102. The Secretary may engage in activities with states related to the reduction of motorcycle fatalities. Section 103. The Department's Working Capital Fund is authorized to provide payments in advance to vendors to carry out the Federal Transit Pass Transportation Benefit Program. Section 104. The Secretary shall post on the website a schedule of all meetings of the Credit Council. Federal Aviation Administration Operations, Airport and Airway Trust Fund.
What purpose does the gentlewoman from California rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Spear of California. Page 11, line 4, after the dollar amount, insert increased by $500,000. Page 11, line 10, after the dollar amount.
Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent that reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection. Chair later is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On July 6th of this year, Asiana Airlines Flight 214 from Incheon, South Korea, crashed on its final approach to San Francisco International Airport, which is in my district. Initial reports made clear that low airspeed was a crucial factor in that crash. It was a horrible accident. 3 Chinese 16-year-old girls on their way to a summer camp in Southern California lost their lives. It could have been an absolute catastrophe because there were over 300 people, including crew, that survived that horrific day. Low airspeed has been a concern for air safety for almost 20 years. In 1996, the FAA's human factor team concluded that flight crews needed better warnings that the aircraft was reaching low airspeeds. In 2003, following the crash that killed our congressional colleague, Senator Paul Wellstone, the National Transportation Safety Board recommended the FAA study whether to require installation of low airspeed audible and visual alert systems. Following the Colgan air crash in Buffalo, New York, a recommendation was reissued in 2010 on installation of redundant audible and visual warnings of impending hazardous low-speed conditions. Now, after almost 2 decades since the initial recommendation and over 3 since the recommendation after Colgan, the FAA has not addressed this question of whether existing commercial aircraft should be required to install low airspeed warning systems. I fear that without direction from Congress, the FAA could take years to complete the study. That is why I'm offering this amendment, which provides the FAA $500,000 to conduct and complete a study on this important question within 1 year. Low airspeed alert systems that cry out airspeed low are available and require a simple software change. These differ from the tonal alerts that sound similar to other pilot alerts. The FAA should investigate whether existing low airspeed tonal warnings, such as those in a Boeing 777, provide a sufficient level of pilot warning, or if instead a verbal warning, such as those in the newer 737s, provides a higher level of safety. When the alert signals to a pilot that they are traveling at too low airspeed, they have at best a few seconds to react. It is vital that planes have alerts that are instantly recognizable, clear, and unambiguous. Airline safety advocates argue that verbal alerts are more effective at alerting a pilot that they are flying at too low an airspeed because they are instantly recognizable to the pilot. If a verbal warning is found to be more effective, the FAA should take expedient action to require both new aircraft and existing aircraft to incorporate a verbal warning. Mr. Chairman, I had the pleasure just last week to talk to Sully Sullenberger, the pilot of the Miracle of Hudson River. And he said something very compelling to me. He said that when a pilot is in a position of reacting during a crash, they need every one of their senses being alerted. The senses when you're holding the throttle, the senses when you hear low speed alert, and the senses when you see stall. And I thought that was very compelling. We have a number of cases that suggest now that low airspeed alerts that are verbal should be incorporated. The FAA has dragged its feet, and I believe that this particular amendment would be very helpful and save many lives in the future. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman cannot reserve. Gentlewoman yields. For what purpose the gentleman from Virginia rise?
The committee accepts the amendment. It's a good amendment. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Arizona. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
We believe that these monies would expedite the study to see how better warnings could be given at low speed, so we approve the amendment.
And gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Clerk will. What purpose the gentleman from Florida rise?
Mr. Chairman, are we at the point in the reading of the bill?
The gentleman is correct.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I rise to offer an amendment to H.R. 2610.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Hastings of Florida. Page 11, line 9, after the dollar amount, insert increase by $3,497,000.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. To echo the words of my colleagues, ranking members, Nita Loy and Ed Pastor, my good friend, the allocation provided for THUD appropriations under the Ryan budget, which was, quote, deemed passed, unquote, by my Republican colleagues, is simply unworkable. From funding for the Federal Aviation Administration Tiger grants, public transit programs, Amtrak, high-speed rail, community development block grants, and the Home Affordable Housing Program, House Republicans are offering a bill that not only makes devastating cuts to our nation's transportation infrastructure, but vital programs in housing, health care, education, labor, and other services that millions of Americans rely on in order to spare defense spending from sequestration. In particular, this bill makes detrimental cuts to aviation programs and investments in our national air system. It cuts FAA operations by $185 million below the President's budget request. It slashes $575 million, 21%, from the FAA's facilities and equipment account and casts doubt on the future hiring of air traffic controllers and inspectors. NextGen is a full multi-year effort to modernize our nation's air traffic control system by transitioning from a ground-based navigation system to a satellite-based navigation system. As it is implemented, NextGen will help reduce delays, expand air traffic system capacity, and mitigate aviation's impact on the environment while ensuring the highest levels of safety. Currently, the FAA is moving from NextGen program development into baseline and operational programs, and passengers and operators are beginning to experience the benefits of these investments. However, while the bill preserves funding for the NextGen programs currently under deployment, it forces the FAA to greatly slow down its NextGen modernization of the air traffic control system. My amendment restores funding for NextGen programs to the fiscal year 2013 level within the operations planning account. It really does represent a small amount, approximately $3.5 million over the FY 2014 House funding level of $56.6 million for a total of $60.1 million. The increased funding would help ensure that FAA remains on schedule with regard to NextGen implementation, while giving it the flexibility to decide how best to move forward in this challenging budget environment. I do recognize that the chairman and ranking member were given a difficult task, and I respect that. But we cannot fail to recognize the future of our NextGen implementation. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida yields back. For what purpose? The gentleman from Virginia rise.
Strike the requisite number of words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Arise in opposition. The committee is opposed to the amendment. The committee shares the gentleman's support of NextGen programs. However, this amendment increases one activity in the operations account and makes no other further adjustments. The result is individual program levels that exceed the account level, which you cannot do. To meet our allocation, the subcommittee looked closely at all accounts and all programs. The subcommittee placed a high priority on FAA operations with just a 2% cut below the budget request. Within the operations account, the subcommittee balanced the number of high priority areas, including NextGen, aviation safety, and air traffic control. This amendment throws this account off balance, and the programs within the account would no longer add up to the top line, and the FAA could simply ignore the subcommittee's direction on other program levels in the account. So therefore, we urge a no vote.
And the gentleman yield back.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For purpose of the gentleman from Arizona rise.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
The amendment increases funding for the FAA's NextGen office by $3.5 million. As my colleague, Mr. Hastings, it is for future development, and I would agree with him that it's something that we need to invest in, and this would accelerate the implementation of NextGen, which is greatly needed. Our air traffic control system is aging and needs modernization, but as Mr. Wolf has pointed out, the allocation was so tight that moving money in the account will cause some problems. My hope will be that hopefully if there is a reconciliation with the Senate, that this would be given a higher priority and in the funding levels as we work with a conference with the Senate. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Question on is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida will be postponed. And gentleman from Florida, clerk will read.
Page 13, line 16, Facilities and Equipment, Airport and Airway Trust Fund, $2,155,000,000.
For what purpose, the gentleman from Florida rise?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'm going to talk about NextGen, and I ask unanimous consent that my full statement be put into the record, Mr. Speaker.
Does the gentleman have an amendment at the desk?
I do.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Hastings of Florida. Page 14, line 9. After the first dollar amount, insert the following. Reduced by $870,031,000, increased by $870,031,000.
The gentleman from Florida is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that my full statement be put into the record so that I can assist in saving time.
That will be requested to be covered under the rule.
Mr. Speaker,
the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I do wish to point out that the bill before us today makes deep cuts to FAA facilities and equipment. Make no mistake, these reductions will directly impact and delay the implementation of NextGen. I've spoken to this issue. This particular amendment makes available approximately $870 million for NextGen capital programs, which is the FY 2013 enacted level. This increased funding would help ensure that the FAA remains on schedule with regard to NextGen implementation. And let me make it very clear, I fought very hard along with my colleagues, both current and former, Republican and Democrat, to bring the NextGen facilities to the West Palm Beach Airport. We were very successful in that regard, but I'm troubled that we might not get to full implementation if we continue the reductions that I see that are set forth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida yields back. Does there a member seek recognition? The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Gentleman from Florida.
A recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida will be postponed. The clerk will read.
Page 15, line 1, Research, Engineering, and Development, Airport and Airway Trust Fund, including rescission, $145 million.
For what purpose, the gentleman from Florida rise?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be unrelenting in this effort to try and make sure that we deal with the necessary funds.
Does the gentleman from Florida have an amendment at the desk?
I do.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Hastings of Florida. Page 15, line 16, strike that and insert that $61,960,000 shall be available for NextGen research and development as authorized by Section 48102A of Title 49 United States Code, provided further.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and my apologies for getting ahead of the necessary protocol. You know, in Switzerland yesterday, there was a collision of trains, one moving north and the other moving south. A good friend of Mr. Wolf's and Mr. Pastor and mine served as chairman and ranking member of the Transportation Appropriations Committee, James Overstar. And in addition to many things that Jim suggested during his tenure here, and I think back to some of the things that would have put us in a better position than we are today, particularly on overall infrastructure, roads, and rail. I can't understand, and I was saying to the young staffer working with me, what it is that causes the rail industry, both abroad and here, to not have the necessary equipment that would allow one train on the same track to let the other train coming from the opposite direction and vice versa know that they're both on the same track. There just seems to be something wrong with that when we have the kind of sophisticated equipment that we do. NextGen in the air area of the world allows for us to avoid those kinds of problems and to increase the efficiency and safety. It reduces ultimately delays and saves fuel, and particularly if we get on with what I'm asking for, and that's $62 million for next-gen research and development activities from the FAA's Research, Engineering, and Development account. Again, I'm not asking anything that I think would do anything less than help all of us. We don't just live in these places, we fly there. Our aviation industry contributes nearly $1.3 trillion to the United States economy. Furthermore, the FAA's air traffic controllers manage nearly 70,000 flights per day, which on an annual basis carry more than 730 million passengers. With such a vital role in our economy, now is not the time to underfund our nation's air traffic control system. I urge my colleagues to make real investment in our nation's transportation infrastructure by supporting this next-gen amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose? The gentleman from Virginia rise.
I rise. Strike the requisite number of words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. We share the gentleman's support of next-gen programs. However, fencing off this amount for next-gen could have the unintended consequences of forcing cuts to other priorities such as aviation safety research and programs to improve air traffic control in the near term, including programs to reduce noise and carbon emissions, and therefore urge a no vote and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Any member seeking recognition? The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The gentleman from Florida.
Again, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida will be postponed. The clerk will read.
Page 15, line 19. Grants in aid for airports, liquidation of contract authorization, limitation on obligations, airport and airway trust fund, $3,200,000,000. Administrative provisions, Federal Aviation Administration, Section 110. None of the funds may be used to compensate in excess of 600 technical staff years. Section 111, none of the funds shall be used to pursue guidelines requiring airport sponsors. Section 112, the administrator may reimburse amounts made available to satisfy 49 United States Code 41742A1. Section 113, amounts collected shall be credited to the appropriation current at the time of collection. Section 114, none of the funds shall be available for paying premium pay under subsection 5546A of Title V, United States Code, unless such employee performed work during the time corresponding to such premium pay. Section 115, none of the funds may be obligated or expended for an employee to purchase a store gift card through a government-issued credit card. Section 116, none of the funds may be obligated for retention bonuses without prior written approval. Section 117, none of the funds may be used to implement any limitation on the ability of any owner of a private aircraft to obtain a blocking of that owner's aircraft registration number. Section 118, none of the funds shall be available for salaries of more than 7 political and presidential appointees. Section 119, none of the funds may be used to increase fees pursuant to Section 44721 of Title 49, United States Code, until the FAA conducts a public outreach. Section 119A, none of the funds may be used to change weight restrictions or rules at Teterboro Airport in Teterboro, New Jersey. Federal Highway Administration, limitation on administrative expenses, Highway Trust Fund, $417 million. Federal Aid Highways, limitation on obligations, Highway Trust Fund, $40,256,000,000. Liquidation of Contract Authorization Highway Trust Fund, $40,995,000,000. Administrative Provisions, Federal Highway Administration, Section 120. The Secretary shall not distribute from the obligation limitation for federal aid highways amounts authorized for administrative expenses by Section 104A of Title 23 United States Code. Section 121. Funds received by the Bureau of Transportation Statistics may be credited to the Federal Aid Highways account. Section 122. Any Buy America requirement for federal aid highway projects, the Secretary shall make an informal public notice on the intent to issue such waiver. Section 123.
Clerk will suspend. What reason, gentleman? Purpose of the gentleman from Virginia rise.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Wolf of Virginia, page 29, beginning on line 23, strike Section 123.
Per an agreement.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Per an agreement with the authorizing committee, this amendment strikes Section 123 under the administrative provision of the Federal Highway Administration. This section has made certain unobligated balances of contract authority available. 2014 is non-controversial, no budgetary scoring effects. I respectfully ask for a yes vote and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For purpose of the gentleman from Arizona rise.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
The amendment strikes $13.25 million in additional funds for the administrative expenses for the Federal Highway Administration. While I will not object to my friend's amendment, I do have concerns that the more we cut on the administrative expenses of the agencies, their ability to do proper oversight will suffer. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Clerk will read.
Page 31, line 3, Section 124. None of the funds shall be used to approve the imposition of any toll on any segment of highway located on the federal aid system in Texas that, as of the date of enactment of this act, is not tolled. Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, Motor Carrier Safety Operations and Programs, Liquidation of Contract Authorization, Limitation on Obligations, Highway Trust Fund, $259 million. Motor Carrier Safety Grants, Liquidation of Contract Authorization, Limitation on Obligations, Highway Trust Fund, $313 million. Administration Provision, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Section 130, funds appropriated shall be subject to terms and conditions. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Operations and Research, $117 million, of which $20 million shall remain available until September 30th, 2015. Operations and Research, Liquidation of Contract Authorization, Limitation on Obligations, Highway Trust Fund, $139,175,088. Highway Traffic Safety Grants, Liquidation of Contract Authorization, Limitation on Obligations, Highway Trust Fund, $561,500,000. Administrative Provisions, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Section 140, an additional $130,000 shall be made available to pay for travel and related expenses for state management reviews. Section 141, the limitations on obligations shall not apply to obligations for which obligation authority was made available in previous public laws. Section 142, none of the funds shall be used to implement Section 404 of Title 23, United States Code. Federal Railroad Administration, Safety and Operations, $184,500,000. Railroad Research and Development, $35,250,000. Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing Program. The Secretary is authorized to issue direct loans and loan guarantees pursuant to Sections 502 through 504 of the Railway Revitalization and Regulatory Reform Act of 1976 Public Law 94-210. Operating grants to the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, $350 million.
Clerk suspend. For what purpose the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment. The gentleman will specify the amendment.
It is number 75.
I don't think I have any Brown of Georgia amendments.
The gentleman will submit the amendment to the desk.
Hey, Tom.
We're passed.
I thought we were on page 8. I mean 30. Where are we?
We are currently.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman will suspend.